Friends, hello. On August 24th, 1572, one of the most horrific crimes in the history of 16th century Europe, and perhaps in the entire history of Europe, took place. This crime, or rather mass murder, went down in history as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It was a widespread slaughter of Huguenots by Catholics in the city of Paris. Before we dive into the events of that night, let's discuss what was happening in France and Europe in the 16th century. Who were the Huguenots? Why were they being killed? This story involves many historical figures, including several named Henry. As I often do in such cases, I've chosen my favorite characters from Spirited Away to help tell the story and represent our historical figures. The 16th century in Europe was, on one hand, the era of the Renaissance, and on the other, a time when all of Europe feared a Turkish invasion. The Turks were besieging Vienna and threatening to conquer Europe. Most importantly, this was the era of the Reformation. It all began in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his famous theses to the church door, calling for the reformation of the Catholic Church. Within the Catholic Church, a movement emerged that would later be called Protestantism, and its followers became known as Protestants. We haven't covered the Reformation in detail yet in our history lessons, but we'll dedicate a separate episode to it. In brief, it was a struggle to purify the church, which at that time was mired in corruption, a situation that dissatisfied the emerging bourgeois class in Europe. This new social class needed a new church. The struggle between Protestants and Catholics began to spread across Europe, starting in Germany, then moving to Northern Europe, the Netherlands, present-day Belgium, and gradually Switzerland. Major powers like Italy, France, and Spain were also drawn in. Spain, however, was a different case. As the leading Catholic country in Europe, it suppressed Protestantism wherever possible. The Holy Roman Empire and its emperor also fought against Protestants for a long time, as did the Pope, naturally. Notice how Protestants and Catholics viewed each other. Protestants said a papist, a Catholic, was worse than a Turk, while Catholics believed Protestants were far worse than the Ottomans because they threatened the very institution of the state and, above all, the Church. This struggle began as a battle of debates, polemics, and eloquence, but eventually, people started killing each other. Today, it may seem strange. There are Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and everyone is free to believe and worship as they choose. But back then, if you were a Catholic, you were part of a state system led by your king and the Pope, who was seen as the father and protector of all Catholics. Protestants were perceived as a threat to the very foundations of society. Religion wasn't a personal matter, it was a public and state affair. If you were a Protestant, you weren't just a neighbor living on the same street as a Catholic. You were seen as a heretic, someone who threatened good Catholics and the very idea of the state. It was an us versus them mentality. Gradually, Protestantism spread to France. One of the most prominent Protestant preachers in France was John Calvin, who began promoting these ideas among the bourgeoisie and aristocracy. So, who were the Huguenots? Huguenots were French Protestants. Why were they called Huguenots? One theory suggests the term comes from a distorted German word, Eichnos, meaning confederate, used to refer to the Swiss, where Protestantism was already flourishing. In France, the Huguenot movement began to grow. Calvin preached its ideas, and for a while, things remained peaceful because the Protestant movement was still small. However, in 1534, the first social upheaval occurred. In nearly all major French cities, posters and leaflets appeared denouncing the Church's authority, particularly the Pope and bishops, mainly over the issue of indulgences. You know what indulgences were. You sinned, whether it was adultery or murder, and you could pay the Church to have your sins forgiven. Naturally, this became a breeding ground for corruption, and the controversy over indulgences was at the heart of the conflict. In 1534, the so-called affair of the placards began. Across France, in major cities, on cathedrals, churches, and government buildings, Protestants hung these leaflets. King Francis I, the French monarch at the time, was deeply troubled by this because it revealed that the Huguenots were no longer just heretics. They had infiltrated the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and even some clergy were siding with them. Francis I launched the affair of the placards, initiating arrests and widespread persecution of Huguenots in France. John Calvin, the main ideologue of the Huguenots, fled to Switzerland. Though, to be fair, he didn't flee immediately. He spent some time moving among the courts of French aristocrats, including the court of the Queen of Navarre, who will appear later in our story. Eventually, he escaped to Switzerland. But the movement couldn't be stopped. Huguenots were gaining strength in the French kingdom. In France, monarchs changed. Francis I died, and his son, Henry II, took the throne. Henry II also died, leaving behind his wife, Catherine de' Medici, who became a central figure in our story. Catherine was the widowed queen, and her relationship with Henry II had deteriorated by the end of his life because he was infatuated with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. After his death, Catherine became the regent queen. She had 3 sons and a daughter who are relevant to our story. Her sons Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry, and her daughter Margaret. When Francis II ascended the throne at the age of 16, it was clear he lacked the experience to govern, so his mother, Catherine, effectively ruled the kingdom. This was in 1547. Let's step back a decade to 1537. France was at war with the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, a powerful Catholic family that also governed Spain. This war wasn't about religion, but about territorial control. During this war, 2 comrades served together, who will become our main characters, Gaspard de Coligny and François de Guise. Coligny came from an ancient, but relatively poor Burgundian aristocratic family. His father was a marshal of France, and Coligny himself was a brave and remarkable man who would later become an outstanding military commander. His career was on the rise. The other figure, François de Guise, came from an influential family from Lorraine, a French province. The Guise family had significant financial and religious influence, with prominent clergymen, including Lorraine cardinals, in their ranks. Both Coligny and Guise were Catholics at this point and served together in the war. Coligny distinguished himself, earning the rank of general colonel from the French king. In 1547, Coligny was captured and imprisoned in Ghent, a city now in Belgium, but then part of Flanders, a region already influenced by Protestantism. While in captivity, Coligny corresponded with John Calvin, one of the leading Protestant ideologues. Gradually, he converted to Protestantism. During the war, he also had a falling out with Guise, his former friend, though this wasn't yet about religion. Their friendship ended, and Coligny remained in captivity, first in Ghent, then in Spanish custody, until just before the First Religious War. When he returned to France, he was a committed Protestant. I firmly believe that success in any endeavor depends on the details. The Guise family began to play a significant role at the French court. With Catherine de' Medici's 16-year-old son, Francis II, on the throne, the Guises arrived in Paris and seized control of the levers of power. They gained immense influence, and the young king fell under their sway. Catherine, of course, was displeased but powerless to stop them. What does falling under their influence mean? It's not just a textbook phrase, it means the Guises controlled the military, religious, and financial resources, including the distribution of state positions. They essentially dominated the French state system. Naturally, this upset some people. Another faction of French aristocracy emerged, the Bourbon-Condé clan. This included Louis de Bourbon-Condé and his son Henry, as well as Louis's brother, Antoine de Condé, and his son, also named Henry. Tensions arose between the Bourbons-Condé and the Guises, exacerbated by religious differences. The Guises were staunch Catholics, while the Bourbons-Condé were Protestants. This set the stage for conflict, though it wasn't yet armed warfare. just 2 steps away from it. Louis and Antoine de Condé planned a conspiracy to besiege the castle of Amboise, where the young king and his mother resided. Their goal was to kidnap the king and queen mother, convince the king to expel the Guises, and replace them with the Bourbon-Condé family. However, with so many people involved, the plot was discovered. The royal court strengthened the castle's defenses, and in 1560, the Huguenots' attempt to storm Amboise failed. The Guises triumphed, and the king remained safe. Yet, Catherine de' Medici, understanding that a clash between 2 powerful aristocratic families, both tied to the royal house, could lead to civil war, sought to prevent escalation. She convened a meeting of nobles to discuss, among other things, religious tolerance. After all, it was the Age of Enlightenment, not the Middle Ages. The idea was to find a way for Catholics and Huguenots to coexist as subjects of the king, united for France's prosperity. At this assembly, Gaspard de Coligny openly declared himself a Huguenot and demanded freedom of worship for all Huguenots in France. He argued that they were loyal subjects of the king and should be allowed to practice their faith without persecution. Catherine recognized that Huguenots were gaining influence among the elite and, to avoid civil war, sought to reconcile the feuding Guise and Bourbon-Condé clans. That same year, 16-year-old Francis too died, likely from lung disease, a common affliction among Catherine's children. She outlived nearly all her children, including those who became kings. Following Francis's death, her second son, Charles IX, ascended the throne at age 10, leaving Catherine to continue ruling as regent. The Guises retained their strong influence at court, but Catherine attempted to broker peace. In 1562, she issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, granting Huguenots limited religious freedoms, including the right to worship in their own churches. This seemed to resolve the conflict. Catherine also made a strategic move by inviting Antoine de Navarre, a Huguenot from the opposing faction, to Paris, appointing him lieutenant general of the court. Antoine converted to Catholicism, bringing his young son to Paris and aligning with the royal court. This administrative maneuver aimed to ease religious tensions and integrate a former opponent into the system. The Bourbon-Condé clan, seeing one of their leaders at court, felt reassured and less inclined to fight. The Guises, however, were not on board. They began plotting their own political strategy. With religious influence through their Lorraine cardinals and financial resources, they lacked only military power. François de Guise formed a triumvirate with Marshal of France Saint-André and Constable of France Montmorency, securing military might. On March 1, 1562, in the town of Vassy, armed men led by François de Guise attacked Huguenots during a worship service, killing 60 people. The Guises then seized the Queen and young King, Charles IX, pressuring them to revoke the Edict of Saint-Germain, outlawing Huguenots. This sparked the First Religious War. The Huguenots, led by Louis de Bourbon-Condé, his son Henry, and Gaspard de Coligny, rose in rebellion. Antoine de Condé, having converted to Catholicism after receiving a state position, joined the Guise camp. This war, though framed as religious, was fundamentally a civil conflict. Its key figures included, on the Huguenot side, Louis de Bourbon-Condé, his son Henry, and Gaspard de Coligny. On the Catholic side, François de Guise, his sons Henry and Charles, Constable Montmorency, Marshal Saint-André, Queen Catherine de' Medici, her 10-year-old son Charles IX, and Antoine de Navarre with his young son Henry. The Huguenots captured the city of Orleans, a significant French center, and formed an alliance with England. Because England is also a Protestant country, if things are bad in France, they are good in England. The English immediately support this conflict and back the Huguenots. The French, in turn, secure the support of Catholic Spain. And so the war begins to escalate. There are casualties and field battles. The Catholics respond by capturing the city of Rouen, the same Rouen where Joan of Arc was burned during the 100 Years' War. The siege of Rouen is brutal. with fierce clashes. During this siege, Antoine de Bourbon, who had defected from the Huguenots to the Catholics, is killed. We remove him from the historical stage. His son, Henry, remains, but he is not yet a key player. A fragile balance emerges as Condé's forces march toward the French capital, preparing to besiege Paris. But at some point, they unexpectedly turn back and retreat to Normandy. After several brutal confrontations, the following happens. Marshal of France Saint-André is killed, Constable of France Montmorency is captured by the Huguenots, and the Huguenot leader Condé is captured by the Catholics. That's the situation. Leaders from both sides are in enemy hands. The Huguenots gain a new leader, Gaspard de Coligny. The First Religious War ends with the death of François de Guise, Coligny's main adversary, during the Siege of Orleans. We remove him from the story as well. Thus, the First Religious War concludes. In 1563, the Queen issues an edict known as the Peace of Amboise. This peace treaty stipulates that prisoners are to be returned to their families, and Huguenots are once again granted freedom of worship. They are told, please hold your services. It seems like everything is resolved, but it's not. The peace treaty doesn't last long because the Guise family is effectively preparing a coup. Their patriarch is dead, but Henry de Guise, his brother Charles, and the entire family are forming an international alliance of Catholic powers. They negotiate again with the Spanish and the Holy Roman Emperor, aiming to pressure the Queen and King to revoke the edict granting religious freedom to the Huguenots. The Huguenots aren't idle either. Gaspard de Coligny, Louis de Bourbon-Condé, and his son Henry prepare their forces for war. The son of the late Antoine de Bourbon, Henry of Navarre, is also growing up. Raised at his mother's court, a Huguenot court, he gradually aligns with the Huguenots. It's clear that both sides are gearing up for war. Moreover, Coligny, who, as we recall, was imprisoned in Ghent, appeals to the Protestant world. The English begin to support him, as do the Germans. The Palatinate, a large county, sends 14,000 soldiers to aid the Huguenots, a significant force for that time, composed of skilled fighters. It's evident that war is brewing in France. The Guises exert increasing influence over the king and queen, arguing that this situation is unacceptable and will ruin France. They point out that the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire also oppose the edict, urging that it be revoked and the Huguenots crushed completely. The Huguenots decide to act preemptively and plan to kidnap the king. After all, if the Catholics did it in the previous cycle, why can't they? This episode goes down in history as the Surprise of Meaux. The king and queen, along with the court, are traveling to Paris when the Huguenots attempt to intercept them. Naturally, the Huguenots are betrayed, and the French court enlists Swiss mercenaries, who form a defensive square around the king and queen as they proceed to Paris. Huguenot cavalry appears on the horizon, but seeing the armed defenses, the kidnapping fails. Then, an event occurs that, after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, will long be held against the Huguenots as the starting point of the violence. In the city of Nîmes, in southern France, where Catharism once flourished, the Huguenots dominate. The South has long been in conflict with Paris, even after the King's Crusades burned southern cities. On the religious holiday of St. Michael's Day, Huguenots massacre Catholic priests in Nîmes. This event, known as the Michelade, will be long remembered against them, with Catholics accusing, "You slaughtered our priests." This sparks the Second Religious War. The war rages in full force, with rivals burning each other's lands, castles, and peasant fields. It continues for a full year, exhausting both sides. At one point, Condé and Coligny besiege Paris, where the royal family is located. They cut off all roads to starve the city of supplies. In a suburb of Paris, Saint Denis, a battle takes place, during which Constable Montmorency is killed. Both sides are depleted, and in 1568, the Peace of Longjumeau is signed, ending the civil war. The peace is short-lived. The Guises, who control the royal court in Paris, are immensely popular and become the true Catholic leaders of France. While this is a war of elites, the common people largely support Catholicism, though some regions back the Huguenots. Paris, however, is predominantly Catholic. The freedom of worship for Huguenots is revoked again. The Huguenots appeal to the European community, and the Dutch, led by William of Orange, send Protestant forces to their aid. The Third Religious War begins. In March 1569, the Battle of Jarnac takes place, a fierce clash in which Huguenot leader Louis de Condé is killed. We remove him from the story. His son, Henry of Bourbon-Condé, and Henry of Navarre declare Gaspard de Coligny their leader. Coligny successfully wages war against the Catholics, capturing the city of Toulouse. At some point, Catherine de' Medici realizes that further conflict could lead to the defeat of the royal army and signs another peace treaty, the Peace of Saint-Germain. As you might guess, like previous agreements, it grants Huguenots freedom of worship across France, except in Paris, which remains a royal city. For cities, La Rochelle, Montauban, Cognac, and La Chérite are designated as Huguenot strongholds, where Protestantism is the main religion. Catherine de' Medici understands that these documents are worthless unless a lasting solution is found. She decides to play a dynastic game to reconcile the two factions. She had tried this before by bringing Antoine de Bourbon to the royal court, but he was killed during the siege of Rouen. Now, she remembers her daughter, Margaret, known from Dumas' Queen Margot. Margaret, a Catholic, is beautiful, well-educated, and popular among men. She is having an affair with Henry's system, Henry de Guise. Catherine, undeterred by this, proposes a marriage between Margaret and Henry of Navarre, the son of the late Antoine de Bourbon, to unite the warring Catholic and Huguenot factions. After negotiations, the marriage is arranged, and the entire country awaits the event, hoping it will end the religious civil war. However, this hope proves futile. Henry of Navarre and Margaret are betrothed, and Paris prepares for the wedding. Huguenot leaders, including Gaspard de Coligny, arrive in the city and gain influence, particularly over King Charles IX. Coligny convinces the king to support Protestants across Europe, arguing they are a dynamic force and allies against the Catholic Spanish, who seek territorial gains. Catherine, aware that France, weakened by 3 civil wars, cannot afford a war with Spain, decides to sabotage this alliance. The Guise family, seeing Coligny's growing influence, supports her. They argue that the Huguenots, led by Coligny and Henry of Bourbon, threaten the kingdom's stability. With the wedding approaching, Catherine devises a sinister plan to eliminate the Huguenot leaders while they are in Paris for the event, believing that without leaders, the Huguenot cause will collapse. The wedding of Margaret and Henry of Navarre takes place on August 18, 1572, but not everyone approves. Pope Gregory XIII refuses to sanction it, and Catholic bishops decline to officiate, forcing the ceremony to occur outside Notre Dame on the cathedral steps. The Huguenot nobility, including Henry of Navarre's mother, arrives in Paris. She dies suddenly, allegedly of pneumonia, though rumors claim Catherine sent her poisoned gloves, a nod to the Medici's reputation for poison, akin to the Borgias. The city is festive, with Huguenots and Catholics mingling, but tension looms. The governor of Paris flees to avoid responsibility. Catherine hesitates to initiate the massacre, but first orders an assassination attempt on Coligny. A gunman shoots him, wounding his arm but not killing him. The Guises, Coligny's enemies since their father's death in the religious wars, are implicated. On August 24, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre begins with the tolling of the bell at Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. Armed men, allegedly guided by white crosses marking Huguenot homes, storm Coligny's residence, kill him, impale his body on a pike, and throw it from a window. Henry of Navarre is spared when Margaret, despite her affair with Henry de Guise, intervenes, declaring him her husband. Terrified, Henry renounces Protestantism and converts to Catholicism to save his life. Henry of Condé is captured and faces execution. The massacre spirals out of control. What began as a targeted killing of Huguenot leaders turns into a citywide bloodbath as Parisian mobs slaughter anyone suspected of being a Huguenot, settling personal scores under the guise of religion. Estimates of the dead range from 3,000 to 10,000 in Paris, with 5,000 to 30,000 killed across France over weeks, as the violence spreads to cities like Orleans. The Seine reportedly runs red with blood from dumped bodies, including Coligny's. His head, allegedly embalmed, is sent to Pope Gregory XIII as proof of the Catholic victory. His body is hung upside down on the Montfaucon gibbet, a massive stone gallows that could hold 45 bodies, later removed and buried by relatives. Some 200,000 Huguenots flee France. Henry of Bourbon is pardoned and released, retreating to his estate, while Henry of Navarre lives with Margaret. King Charles IX dies, and Catherine's last son, Henry III, a former king of Poland known for his frivolous lifestyle and rumored homosexuality, ascends the throne. The Guises grow stronger, and the religious wars continue until the reign of Louis XIII, when Cardinal Richelieu captures the last Huguenot stronghold, La Rochelle. Henry of Navarre reverts to Protestantism and leads the Huguenot army alongside Henry of Condé. Margaret returns to Paris, continuing her affair with Henry de Guise. The Guises, backed by the Catholic populace, challenge Henry III's rule in the War of the Three Henrys, Henry III, Henry de Guise, and Henry of Navarre. The Guises nearly seize power, but Henry III lures Henry de Guise to the Louvre and has him assassinated. Guise's brother Louis is also killed. Henry III is later murdered by a Catholic monk, Jacques Clement, who deems him an unworthy king for killing the Guises and his alleged personal sins. With no male Valois heirs left, Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot, becomes the next in line. Before his coronation, Henry converts to Catholicism again, famously saying, "Paris is worth a mass," prioritizing the throne over faith. He becomes King Henry IV. He and Margaret, who bear no children, divorce. Henry is later assassinated by a Catholic zealot, Ravaillac, who distrusts his conversion. His son, Louis XIII, succeeds him. Margaret, who dies later, leaves her wealth to Louis XIII, whom she cherished. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre shocked Europe. Queen Elizabeth I of England wrote to the French king questioning the slaughter of women and children. Pope Gregory XIII, however, celebrated it as a greater victory than the Battle of Lepanto, where Catholics defeated the Ottomans. He minted a medal depicting an angel with a sword to commemorate it. The massacre dealt a devastating blow to the Huguenots, who continued to fight but never recovered their former strength. It remains one of history's most horrific atrocities.